We human beings love a good story. My very first sermon was about how much people are drawn to them. Stories, of course, entertain us, but they're more powerful than that. They give our lives structure and meaning, too. There are a lot of different kinds of stories. Some of them are pretty small in scope, like those we read in books or watch on TV. Others are huge. What we tell ourselves about who we are, where we are going, how things should be. Some stories are so expansive, we barely even notice that they're there. We just accept them as reality. We crave these bigger stories because they help us understand the world around us. And that makes us feel safe, like the world is predictable. They give us the assurance that no matter what is actually happening around us, we at least know what's going on and what our role should be. Like many of you this past Tuesday evening, I watched the election returns. We had invited several friends over, roughly the same crowd that had watched the election 2 years ago. I found it to be an evening full of confusing and different stories. Unlike 2 years ago, people there started the night nervous. There was the feeling of having been burned, like fans of a sports team that always blow it in the end, where you don't want to get up your hopes too high because you don't want to be emotionally crushed at the end. So you brace for the worst. At the same time, there was also this feeling of incredible urgency and need. The last 2 years had been deeply harmful, not only to the American people themselves, but to the foundation of democracy. That if at any time our country was going to push back on the divisive, abnormal, and damaging mode of politics, then now would have to be the time. What felt at stake was not only the actual country, but a narrative and a story that gives us comfort and security, that tells us who we are as a country, and even the very nature of ourselves and human nature. We Unitarian Universalists, I believe, are a generally optimistic type of people. Our narrative that we tell ourselves is a positive one. We believe that all people are basically good, and that either through reason or reflection and learning, truth and compassion will eventually win out. We see consciously or not evil and wrongdoing as the product of ignorance or illusion, rather than something innate to the human spirit. And many non-UUs believe this as well, rejected the idea of original sin. This narrative is fundamental to who we are, who many of us are, and how we see the world. So waiting for the results on Tuesday night, at least for me and the people I was with, felt a bit like a referendum on that core belief. Would our country and our fellow citizens appear to have that decency that we expect human beings and human nature to have? Would folks come to their senses? If they did, beyond the actual issues at stake, it would relieve us of the anxiety of having a core story shown to be wrong. That we would then have to reevaluate who we thought we were and people were and our country was. Because then our story might not make any sense. It felt like one of my fundamental beliefs was potentially on trial, and the stakes were high. So we watched the results coming on in. It was slow going for a while. A few congressional wins for Democrats on the East Coast, and then Republicans started winning in places the Democrats hoped to take, and even had strong incumbents. In Kentucky, Republicans won a congressional seat that was thought to have a winning Democratic potential. Republicans beat a blue-collar incumbent senator in Indiana and a well-liked former governor of Tennessee. Then Florida and Georgia, with two particularly compelling progressive candidates, began to tilt red, even though polls had suggested they would lean blue. I suspect that for many progressive watching the progression of that night, Florida was especially hard to watch. It was easy to explain away Indiana and Tennessee and then later in the night, Missouri and North Dakota, because those are not progressive states. Neither is Florida, really. But the difference was that in order to feel that the country was really rejecting the toxic brand of politics that we were seeing, progressives had to win in swing states. Otherwise, nothing was changing. And the narrative that we tell ourselves that people can see what decency looks like was being threatened. The news people on TV, if you watch CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, seemed to sense that there was something at stake too. As we flipped through the various stations, we kept hearing about this blue wave. They said it over and over again. Would there be one? How would it show up? How big it would be? That was the question of the night, and everything seemed to connect back to that. One of my friends suggested that this was a subtle sign of the media's liberal bias, a working through of their own anxieties about what was supposed to happen that night. Like those of us there, and the media knew or at least felt the power of narratives. And the idea of a blue wave is a powerful story. It's compelling, it's easy to understand. The story goes that after 2 years, the country would issue a resounding rejection of this kind of politics because it was both common wisdom that the opposition party does well during midterms, but also that basic American values would demand it. That's an easy narrative to tell and to say and believe in. It seemed reasonable and preserves this idea that people make the right choice when pushed. But the only problem was that it wasn't clear that that was actually happening. Certainly not in a full blue wave watching over. On PBS, where we eventually settled, there was an especially telling exchange between a panel of diverse political voices. There was Van Jones, the progressive activist and organizer, on one side, and Rick Santorum, the conservative former senator of Pennsylvania. They were having a back and forth, as they do on these shows, and it was like having two separate worlds because they were telling two completely different stories of what was happening. And they were using literally the same facts and results to tell those different stories. Santorum began by listing all the conservative victories that were happening across the country, pointing to Republican gains in the Senate over strong Democratic incumbents, and victories in key swing states like Florida and Ohio that were potentially expected to lean the other way. He asked, how could that be seen as anything else but an affirmation of the president's agenda and a washout for the blue wave? It was not surprising that Van Jones came back with a completely different narrative. He countered with something else. Democrats crushed it in the House. The group of incredibly diverse candidates won the popular vote by 7% and passed significant progressive legislation, like the one in Florida that gave over 1 million formerly incarcerated people the ability to vote. He asked how that could be anything but a blue wave. That two people could draw diametrically opposed conclusions with the same bit of data is fascinating to me. And it speaks just how powerful stories are and how they shape our perspective and how malleable facts can be in the hands of storytellers. So sitting there that night, I didn't know what to feel. I wasn't sure I could buy into either what Santorum or Van Jones was saying. I was wary of the spin, and I knew that they had agendas. But I could see exactly why they felt the way they did. Neither seemed clearly wrong or clearly right. My takeaway that night was that there wasn't, and still isn't, an easy narrative about what happened this week. The toxic brand of politics was repudiated some places, but gained ground in other places. There was a blue wave over cities and suburbs and a red tide in rural areas. Some progress was made, but the danger and damage our country faces has not gone away and is still very real. But it was all so emotionally ambiguous. My understanding of the world did not get reinforced, but neither was it repudiated. Just left me feeling uneasy and unsettled and unsatisfied. I realize that I don't fundamentally understand our country or the people living in it. Living in this ambiguous place isn't any fun. I don't think it's as terrible as when your heart gets ripped out in total defeat, but it's a different kind of struggle that we face. A struggle that leaves us without a strong sense of direction or what story we are collectively in together. On a spiritual level, that means being left a bit in the wilderness, neither here nor there, neither defeated or clearly victorious, unable to know exactly where we are, what we're doing, and where we're headed. Like Moses and the Israelites during the Exodus, we are wandering in the desert, not because it necessarily has to take 40 years to get from point A to point B, because it doesn't, but just because we never seem to actually arrive. So what is required of us as people who care in a time like this? Progressive, spiritual people trying to make sense of our narratives and our beliefs. It begins, I think, by beginning to give up the illusion that we will ever know exactly what is happening or going on. We have to cling less tightly to what we believe about what this country is and to the stories we tell ourselves. That doesn't mean we shouldn't care or believe things, but it does mean that we need to ensure that our ability to act in the world for good is not dependent on the success and strength of the stories that we believe in. If our work for justice is grounded in our belief that people are inherently good or rational, or the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, then our justice work is conditional. It is fragile because it depends on something that we can't guarantee ourselves, depends on evidence, something outside our ability to control. And it is privileged because it forgets that for many people, justice work is not a choice. It's not a conviction. It's a desperate attempt simply to survive. Our justice work needs to be grounded someplace else. It does not need to be grounded in a story or a belief or an understanding that will not survive the ups and downs that comes with the emotional roller coaster of despair and triumph that so often grip our news media, and our hearts as people who care so deeply. Where our justice work should be grounded in these times of uncertainty and anxiety is in empathy and compassion. Because no matter what we believe or the stories we tell ourselves, we can always recognize the suffering of others and feel for them. We don't need grandiose philosophies or systematic theologies or political treaties. Those are houses of cards that, when threatened, fall and leave us feeling confused and hopeless. We need to remember the human impact of our actions, individually as a nation, and go back to the very basics of why we do this work. Going back to the basics is an antidote. It's an antidote to despair and a way to resiliency. I don't know what the future holds. I don't trust anyone who claims to, whether they're on a panel somewhere or a writer. But we don't need a strong narrative to move forward and do what must need to be done. We have to make peace with our uncertainty because we're on a roller coaster. And while we can do everything we can to ensure that we do our part, we can't control what happens next. We can't control the defeat that happens, the victories that happen. But we can do everything that we can do to ensure that there is certainty, at least in our own convictions and our own motivations. I think we can do it, because I actually believe that there are real signs of progress in this world. And they're not based on a narrative, they're not mythical or preordained or inevitable. A progress that is real regardless of the story we tell. Ballot initiatives that fought gerrymandering across multiple states. That's a huge threat to democracy, and those passed. So did new efforts to enfranchise voters and limit the power of money in elections, right here in New York City. We saw record high voter turnout and engagement, and new laws to protect those on the margins. That's building a system that is fair for the long term. We don't even have to look that much further than the people in this room. Our congregation worked tirelessly in this last election cycle to register voters. Carloads of Fourth Universalist members and friends trekked up to Kingston multiple times to register voters in communities that have been historically marginalized. That's pretty great. And it helped make voter turnout in that district the highest during a midterm election it has ever been. It helped defeat a candidate who used race baiting against his opponent, a tactic that, no matter what your persuasion politically is, should be unacceptable. The results are us doing our part with the power we have in the place that we are. I think we have a long, long time until we get that clear story that would feel so good after watching an election happen. There are still too many battles to fight, too much uncertainty and ambiguity. We may never get what we want. The truth may always be wishy-washy and ambiguous. I hope it's not those 40 years in the desert, like those Israelites from many years ago. This is a time that I think we have to accept, as without clarity and decisive narratives, when we can, if we are not careful, we cling too closely to those, fall into anxiety and despair. More defeats surely lay ahead. But I'm motivated by the words of wise people who've come before. I'm motivated by the words of Elie Wiesel, who wrote, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest. It doesn't matter what is going on, but what is in our hearts." I'm comforted by the words of Mother Teresa. God has not called me to be successful, but to be faithful. I'm inspired by the words of Rumi. Where there is ruin, there is also hope for treasure. And I'm encouraged by the words of Raymond Williams. To be truly radical is to make hope possible, rather than despair convincing. You and I, this community, and many others in this world, we are working together in this work of hope, pushing back on those feelings of confusion and hopelessness. A work that is independent of our immediate success, that requires us to separate from those narratives that threaten to bring us down. We don't have to know exactly what is happening or where we are going. We only need to remember what we are called to do, that does not change in victory or defeat or in that uneasy place where we live. Through all of that, our task remains the same. Find that compassionate place in our heart that calls us to care for each other, to remember it, and to ask what it calls us to do, and then go out and shape the world in its image. Return to that when all else is murky and dark, and let it be a light that shines through whatever we face. May it be so, and amen.
Here at Fourth Universalist, we take an offering each week. We do this not only to support our beloved community here, but also to support the wider work of building a better world.